Exorcist III, released in 1990, 13 years after The Exorcist II, The Heretic. Again, very few people involved with the original movie returned for this one, aside from actor Jason Miller, who was brought back through some very creative writing as Father Karras. What actually sets this movie apart from Heretic, though, is that it was written and directed by The Exorcist's original author, William Peter Blatty, who adapted it from his own novel, Legion, a direct sequel to the original book. Unlike Heretic, it attempts to follow closely the themes and the disturbing horror of the first movie, while going in its own directions. Lieutenant Kinderman, the cop, played by Lee J. Cobb in the original movie, who was investigating a mysterious death connected with Regan's possession, played here by George C. Scott, at his gruffest and grumpiest, is investigating a new batch of extremely gruesome murders, seemingly committed by a notorious serial killer known as the Gemini. Only problem is, the Gemini has been dead for 15 years, the same length of time that has also passed since Regan's possession. Kinderman reluctantly comes to realize that he may be up against supernatural forces here, and that they may have in their grip the body and soul of Father Karras, who gave his life to save Regan all those years ago. Blatty apparently clashed with the producers and the production company over the direction of this film, especially the ending, which he was forced to reshoot in order to add a big exorcism set piece, the kind of thing that you would expect to see in an Exorcist movie. Blatty wasn't happy about it. There have been efforts in recent years to restore his original director's cut, which seems to no longer exist in full, unfortunately. Exorcist III originally received mixed reviews. It did well at the box office, but did not enjoy anywhere near the success of the original. Over the years, it's developed a cult following, and today it enjoys a reputation far, far better than The Heretics. So I think you said this was a first-time watch for you. How did it play for you?
Very well. I've heard good things about this over the years. It's come recommended to me many times from horror film fans and just film fans in general, because I think it's a rare example of a third movie in a series actually being more faithful to the source material. Like, normally the deeper down the rabbit hole you go of sequels, the further away it gets from what originally made it interesting. But Exorcist III, I think, because William Peter Blatty was so involved in it, really does feel like a true sequel to the original. And it's different. Like, it's not the same movie over again. I think the fact that it focuses on Kinderman and, has more of a police procedural kind of structure to it makes it feel almost more akin to something like Seven than the original Exorcist. And in that regard, it's great. It totally works for the whole tone of the movie and the continued exploration of this entity that we were first introduced to in Friedkin's Exorcist. So I was really pleasantly not surprised, because I heard good things, but I my enjoyment of it was confirmed. Like, I had a feeling I was going to like this one, and I really did. I thought the direction was pretty great. The writing, especially. I think William Peter Blatty just has a really, really unique, dark sense of humor that I think even doesn't come fully across in the first film. I think this movie, because he's directing his own words, he can really find the tone that he is truly unique to his voice.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of humor in the movie that I was not expecting and that I really enjoyed. But then also it goes into very dark, disturbing territory, and that really works. There's some properly disturbing stuff in this. Just my general thoughts on it were that I was quite impressed. And I think I'll get into this with Believer, but I feel the worst parts about Exorcist sequels tend to be the exorcisms. I kind of was a little let down by the last act, but I didn't feel like it sunk the movie by any means. It was just kind of it was just what I expected to see, whereas everything before that wasn't really what I was expecting. So
I see, yeah.
With that caveat of maybe sort of being mixed on the ending, I thought this was really terrific.
I mean, the movie, it doesn't have the frightening realism or the intensity of the first film. It's much more credible than the second, but at least when I was watching the third movie, I didn't really felt like I believed anything I was seeing. But the key difference here with 3 is that it's actually involving. There's a story we can follow that is genuinely interesting. There are characters whose emotions and motivations we can understand, and that makes all the difference in the world. You don't mind as much that this one isn't as good as the first because it is creating something of its own, like you said, and you can get invested in it on its own terms. You can appreciate that it's quirkier, funnier, more stylized. And you're right, there are a lot of surprisingly funny moments. The dialogue is very witty. I didn't know until you told me that Blatty had a background in comedy, but it totally makes sense because he has a feel for that. There's an especially entertaining relationship, which Burns and I both really enjoyed when we were watching this together, between Kinderman and Father Dyer, who's actually another character from the original film. He's the one who takes Father Karras's confession at the very end of the original. He's played here by Ed Flanders, a different actor. He and Kinderman have this engagingly cynical yet wisecracking rapport together. And their rhythm at times, like, it approaches screwball in how it's this constant give and take. And Scott and Flanders play that really well. And there's some great surrealist and visual humor too. I really liked the dream sequence where Kinderman is seeing all of the Gemini victims and he sees them being watched over and cared for by angels, one of whom is played by Fabio in a cameo.
There are some bizarre cameos in this.
Yeah. I think I saw Larry King at one point.
C. Everett Koop is in this as well, which I don't know if many people remember him, but like, it's
former Surgeon General.
Yeah, it's like a very, very timely cameo of like, that's I can't picture like what the idea was there. Like, I have Larry King and C. Everett Koop in this movie, but yeah, it's just kind of a part of the weird sense of humor that it has. I actually really liked that Blatty leaves a lot to the imagination, and he's such a great wordsmith that most of these kind of grisly murders that are occurring by the hands of the Gemini killer, we see brief glimpses of. We see, you know, some blood here and there, the aftermath, maybe a body under a sheet, but so much of the horrific things that are happening to the victim, so much of how we hear about it is the police officers explaining it, the Gemini killer himself explaining it, and just the description of what he's done, like the torture techniques that he's come up with to basically savor the agony of his victims. Just the description of them and the performances are very chilling. You know, there's a great moment where, I won't say who he's talking about, but he's the Gemini killer is talking about one of his victims and basically describing how he drained all the blood from his body. It's described in such like gleeful detail, and the way Brad Dourif plays it, of like he's so excited that he's kind of figured out this really unique way to kill somebody, and he's explaining it to George C. Scott like with this real joy of like you know, he calls himself an artist, like he's like, I can't wait to tell you about my process, what I did to this person. It's so interesting. And Blatty's writing really backs that up, that dark humor, but also it's quite disturbing, and he doesn't need to show you that occurring. He doesn't need to have that graphic scene of him doing that. The description really is enough, and there's so much of the movie that is like that, of just really depending on his voice and his ability to express those and put those things in your mind's eye.
I totally agree with you. Like, the movie is very smart, and it is horrifying in its own way, separate from the original. And yeah, those Gemini murders, they're disturbingly horrific without being excessively graphic. and more is suggested than is shown, and what is suggested really does make your skin crawl, which I think keeps this movie away from exploitative territory and makes it feel like a movie that is trying to ask serious questions about good and evil. Like the original, it feels like a movie that takes the existence of God and the devil for granted as a way of asking questions about how human beings confront evil, how we keep faith in humanity, and how we carry the mantle and the burden of good, and how we sacrifice for the sake of good. And I got to say, George C. Scott is a great choice for the lead. He is so good at playing that disgust and anger of a man who's losing his faith in humanity, yet he still has an ability to keep the character vulnerable and sympathetic the whole way. I actually cared about what happened to him and what would happen to his family. So the suspense sequences and the climactic set pieces, like, they actually worked for me the way they were supposed to.
Like the first movie, a movie characterized by just terrific performances across the board. And George C. Scott, that thought occurred to me of, like, even this is later in his career, he's an older man, and the fact that he could still generate that much anger, that much, like, I was like, man, he never really lost it, did he? He was just the highest blood pressure actor of all time. Just his rage is always barely beneath the surface, and there's moments, where he loses himself a little bit, and he loses his patience, and he hits his fist on a desk, or raises his voice at somebody. Or there's even a simple moment, like, I think they're at a cafe or a bar or something, and the waitress just asks him, like, "Can I get you anything, honey?" And he's in the middle of his thought, and so he just kind of barks at her, like, "No, go away," and loses his patience really quickly. Like, there's just so many moments like that of, like, George C. Scott, that was the guy to get for this, of just pure anger. But it's not a caricature. He's a true character. There's that relationship. There's so much vulnerability in putting the fact that his long-standing relationship with who's the preacher at the start of the film?
With Father Dyer.
Father Dyer. I really like that he's kind of his anchor, that they have this relationship. Yeah. Like, he's able to keep him sane a little bit. They go to movies, he helps him get his mind off of this, like, constant, horrible, daily, awful
grind.
Yeah, and it takes you back a little bit, actually, when it takes you back a little bit when he's like, all right, it's after, like, a horrible murder's occurred, and George C. Scott's like, all right, I got to go meet up with Father Dyer. We're gonna go see It's a Wonderful Life.
Yes, I was gonna say that. Yeah, perfect movie choice.
So it's like, okay, so he's, without Father Dyer, he probably wouldn't. It's important for him to be reminded of that, really. Like, Father Dyer kind of is that person for him, of, like, just sort of giving a little bit of relief and jabbing him a little bit. It's not just pure consolation. Like, Father Dyer is a bit of a cynical guy himself, and has an atypical kind of savviness and an irony about the world, and that's also really refreshing. That it's not just a typical preacher character who is saying, there are good people in this world, like, have patience, my son. He's sort of in agreement, saying, like, oh God, yeah, like, everything's gone to hell, and here we are just trying to live. And I really, really liked that subversion and that realness and that relationship, that he can reach George C. Scott more with that point of view, and that frankness. It made that relationship so much more believable and palpable, and made them feel just more like characters we haven't seen before. And I really appreciated that. I really appreciated that there's nothing really copied from the first movie. Like, there's characters that we see, these are characters that we met at the first movie, but they kind of have a minimal influence on the events. They kind of just more serve functional plot purpose in that first movie. they're well played. Lee J. Cobb was very good in that first movie, but this is a much deeper exploration of these people, and it does it justice. It deepens their existence in this world that Blatty's created in a really meaningful way.
You mentioned the final exorcism sequence before as like being a weaker part of the movie, and I agree with that. Yeah, it is more meeting the expectation at the end of throwing this thing of like, okay, now we've got to have an exorcism, and I understand Blatty had to add that at the request of the producers. He didn't want to do it, but I will say I thought he directed it well, because of all these things we talked about, because he does get us invested in the story and he does make us care about the characters. The finale, compromise or not, I thought still worked. I mean, I would be curious to see the attempts at the reconstructed director's cut, but even in this form, I would say this is a solid movie. It's funny, it's smart. It doesn't match the original, but it feels like it has its own reason for existing apart from the original.
My dissatisfaction with it is purely not because it's poorly done. I agree with you. It is well done. And there's even just different visual ideas that Blatty brings to it that Friedkin didn't do. He kind of goes more operatic, really, with lightning striking inside of the cell and literally you kind of see the flames of hell coming up through the ground. It's very, very big, and it's like a proper film Hollywood climax, really. But it's just personal taste here. Like I didn't really want it to go down that direction. I didn't really want it to turn into a Hollywood movie per se. Like I was enjoying this simplified kind of story and this really supernatural, but I mean grounded, I feel, up to that point. And that kind of took it into territory. It was like, okay, yeah, we're watching a movie, and it's an entertaining one, a very well done one, but it's sort of where that first movie that never betrays its tone, never really, it purely commits to the realism of that situation. It's not necessarily a realistic movie, but it's about that feeling of realism, I think.
Yes.
And Exorcist III, I think it kind of tried to have its feet in both. It tried to have some feeling of realism, but then it went into these big operatic scenes in that final act that it just brought me out of it a little bit. So
I understand.
I'm very curious to watch this assembly director's cut that's been put out there recently, because as I understand, they try to restore the ending into more properly what was in the original book and Blatty's original screenplay for it. So I can't really comment on that as of now. I haven't seen it, but I'm very curious to check it out based on what I've heard about it and it being more in keeping with the film that preceded it.